good afternoon. Welcome to another session of In Dialogue Foundation's Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2022-23. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Mrinal Miri, who will speak to us on the topic Indigenous Knowledge and its Transformation. About the speaker, Professor Mrinal Miri is a philosopher and educationalist. From 1970 to 1974, he was a lecturer in philosophy at St. Stephen's College under the University of Delhi before moving to Northeastern Hill University in Shillong. Dr. Miri also served as director of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, from 1993 to 1999. He was also nominated as member of Rajya Sabha from 2012 to 2016. He has been awarded a Padma Bhushan for his contribution in the field of education and literature. He was a member of the National Advisory Council established by the Manmohan Singh's UPA first government for the implementation of the Right to Education Act. To the participants, please keep your cameras on and try and make the session as interactive as possible by asking questions and sharing comments. Professor Miri, thank you so much for joining us today. You will speak for about an hour, and then you will take questions, as you already mentioned. So you may now begin. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yes, okay. Thank you very much for having me on your program this afternoon. Well, I'm sort of semi-retired. I'm actually retired from work, but I do continue to work a little bit at home, read a little bit, write a little bit, and occasionally publish something. So I'm kind of, as far as work goes, I'm kind of semi-retired. I'm getting on in age, so my memory is fading. So I hope, I'll be able to convey something in a coherent fashion to you this afternoon. I shall talk about knowledge, and particularly about indigenous knowledge. I presume that you know something about knowledge, about the distinction between knowledge and knowledge is a state of mind, knowledge and belief. So is belief is a state of mind. So I presume that you know something about the distinction between knowledge and belief. Knowledge is necessarily true. I mean, you can't have knowledge unless what you know is true. What you know, if it proves to be false, then it is not knowledge. It doesn't count as knowledge. So that's the difference between knowledge and belief. And then, of course, we must have knowledge in, say, for instance, in memory, in recognition, and so on. And then I presume you also know that there may be different varieties of knowledge. For instance, one of these varieties is knowing how. Knowing how. I know how to play cricket. I know how to play football. So these are matters of skill. The degree of my skill in any of these practices may vary from very poor to very good. I may be a good footballer, a very poor footballer, but knowing how to play football doesn't require me to have any kind of theoretical knowledge about football, how the football is made, and sort of how to kick the ball and so on. I learn the skill, but I don't learn theories about football. So knowledge of skill is different from knowing a theory or knowing what is sometimes called by philosophers, knowing that something is the case is different from knowing how something is the case. Knowing how to do something, not something is the case, knowing how to do something. So we have knowledge how to do things and knowledge that something is the case. I know that I'm at the moment speaking online to an audience which I can't see. Well, that's a kind of very novel experience. Not so novel nowadays, but normally when I used to teach, I used to have an audience before me, and I used to occasionally look at people's faces and also detect what is going on, perhaps, in the mind of the person listening to me. Either is he attending to me, not attending to me, that sort of thing. So that's knowing how and knowing that. Now, I shall not go on about this. I presume that you know or you have some idea of what knowledge is, how knowledge is different from belief, etc. How we can know how to do things. I know how to cook, but for that I don't have to have knowledge of how to write a recipe. That may be a little bit of a theoretical knowledge, and knowledge that that the earth is round. That is knowledge that. And so on. So I shall not talk about all this. I shall then talk about what I said, indigenous knowledge. We talk frequently nowadays about indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge, what is indigenous knowledge? I want to ask that question and try and answer it, and see how indigenous knowledge can compare or compares with knowledge which is not indigenous. What is knowledge that is not indigenous? Knowledge that is not indigenous is universal. It is knowledge all over the place. Knowledge that is indigenous is specific to a place, specific to maybe a time also. So now, let us say knowledge kind of requires a knower, and that is also a knower. A knower can be an individual or a number of individuals or a collective. In the case, for instance, of scientific knowledge, who's the knower? The knower is the collective, the collective, which is the scientific community. That's a collective. So the scientific community is the knower. And in the case of indigenous knowledge, assuming that there is such a thing as indigenous knowledge, the knower presumably is the collective, which we may term indigenous people. So in India, we talk about indigenous people and people who are not indigenous. Now, what is this difference between indigenous people and people who are not indigenous? So if we're talking about indigenous knowledge, we must inevitably also talk about indigenous people. Obviously, globally speaking, in terms of the entire world, indigenous people constitutes a large class of human beings with multiple members. Now, indigenous people is not, there is in India, there are indigenous people, there are indigenous communities. Globally speaking, there are hundreds of indigenous communities. So we may call each member, that is each indigenous community, and it is quite likely that each indigenous community's knowledge is distinct from that of the others. That is a possibility that we must consider. Who then, talking specifically about our country, India, who then are the indigenous people of our country? I shall mention three groups in relation to the issue of knowledge. People who claim their origin in this country, a written tradition, and a wealth of textual material that covers vastly different areas of human life. That is, people who claim their origin in this country. And I'm talking about one group of people, people who claim their origin in this country and who have written tradition and a wealth of textual material that covers vastly different areas of human life. Knowledge, of course, what we now call, the knowledge that these people claim, knowledge which includes the arts, including performing arts, health, politics, education, religion, and very importantly, non-human world. This is these are the areas in which they claim knowledge. I'm, of course, referring to the tradition that the Aryans, for want of a better word, have left for us. There may be controversy about their being indigenous. Some people claim that Aryans are not indigenous to India, but I shall leave this controversy alone. And so the third group, the third group of indigenous people I mentioned below may provide some mitigation of this controversy. I have not come to that as yet. I shall talk about it. I'm also not excluding Dravidians. I've talked about Aryans, and of course, Dravidians claim they are not Aryans, with their equally rich written traditions. Now, second group of people that I shall talk about are people who have originated in this country because there is neither anecdotal nor historical evidence of their having their origins anywhere other than within boundaries of this country. So they have originated in this country, and we know that they have originated in this country, or we claim to know that they have originated in this country, because there is neither anecdotal nor historical evidence of their having their origins elsewhere, other than within the boundaries of this country. They comprise most of what we call our tribal communities. Most of our tribal communities are indigenous in this sense. They originate in this country, but because we know that they originate in this country, but they have no written, they do not have written traditions, but are the owners of marvelously rich oral traditions. These are complex traditions of thinking, imagining, and doing in the context of human life. Reflections on man's temporality, they include these imaginations and remembrance of practices, not remembrance, practices. In the context of reflections on man's temporality, his or her well-being, his or her relation with other human beings and the non-human world, the rights and wrongs of things, collective affirmation of life and its beauty. E.g., they have music, they have dance, and so on. So the indigenous, this group of people who are indigenous that I have mentioned, they have all this. They have reflections on men's temporality, his or her well-being, his or her relations with other human beings and the non-human world, the rights and wrongs of things, collective affirmation of life and its beauty, easy music, dance, and so on. Knowledge, of course, is an essential ingredient of these traditions, these individuals. The third group consists of a small consists of, again, of small communities, mostly in our official vocabulary, tribal communities who have at various times in the ancient past come to this country from distant lands, but have established themselves here and have belonged here for scores of centuries. So there are people, these are people who have lived with us for thousands of years, and they have the same kind of traditions that I have mentioned that the second group of, that is a group of indigenous people have, but they claim their origin elsewhere, or we know that they originated elsewhere and have come to this country. They, like the other groups of tribal communities, have similarly rich oral traditions, traditions of thinking, knowing, imagining, and doing. These traditions must be considered as indigenous as the traditions of the other two groups. So, but indigenous as opposed to what? One suggestion might be knowledge originating in people from outside the country. But of course, there must be indigenous knowledge in countries other than our own. Sorry. One suggestion might be knowledge originating with people within the country. But of course, there must be indigenous knowledge in countries other than our own. This cannot therefore be a contrast we are looking for. Indigenous knowledge and knowledge that is not indigenous. The proper contrast would be, in effect, be knowledge that knowledge that knows no geographical boundaries, even perhaps no temporal boundaries, universal global knowledge. That is the contrast maybe we are looking for. Even perhaps no temporal boundaries, universal global knowledge. The shining example of which is the modern scientific knowledge originating in the West. There might be a question about a kind of knowledge that knows no temporal boundaries. I just mentioned that this is knowledge, scientific knowledge, may not even have temporal boundaries. As we all know and are repeatedly told, scientific knowledge is open, i.e., it is open to question, revision, and even rejection in the future. There is no final report on a piece of scientific research. This only means that scientific knowledge, in spite of its claim to unrivaled superiority, is bound by the contingencies of time, change. Only kind of knowledge which will then have a claim to transcend the bounds of time will be knowledge that is itself atemporal, that is not temporal. The most likely example of such knowledge will, I suppose, be mystical knowledge, knowledge that is bound, that is beyond spatial and temporal boundaries, and therefore ineffable, that is, cannot be talked about. Because to articulate it, to talk about it, it is necessary to temporalize, therefore distort it. You see, this century's, not this century, our time, last century's great philosopher, man called Wittgenstein, his famous last words in his first book called Tractatus Logica Philosophicus were, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This is talking about mystical knowledge. Today, we shall not be concerned with this kind of knowledge at all. But indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge seem to share the quality of temporal limitation of knowledge. What is valid at one point of time may be shown to be invalid at another point of time. But indigenous knowledge is location-specific, while scientific knowledge is universal. There then seem to be at least two varieties of knowledge, the indigenous variety and the knowledge and the trans-indigenous modern variety of global knowledge. The question to ask, therefore, is are there different varieties of knowledge, or is knowledge really one and universal? It is an important question to ask because we are thinking of the possibility of indigenous knowledge as knowledge at all. Then we must face up to the question of whether we can think of it as a distinct mode of knowledge, different from scientific, global, universal knowledge. It is an impossibility if indigenous knowledge is an impossibility, if knowledge is one and universal. Then our task would be limited to showing that what is claimed as indigenous knowledge is either a curious, non-epistemic practice among indigenous people, or that it is in fact not knowledge at all among indigenous people, or that it indeed shows genuine aspirations for knowledge, but falls woefully short of it. The indigenous knowledge we talk about is either not knowledge at all, or it is knowledge mistakenly so called. This is what we might think. To have a justified claim to knowledge in the correct sense of the term, it must be reducible to the modern universal variety of knowledge. If such reduction proves impossible, then indigenous knowledge will turn out to be an extremely dubious category. So the claim is that indigenous knowledge is not knowledge until we are able to reduce this knowledge to scientific knowledge, to the modern scientific variety of knowledge. If such reduction is not possible, then there is no such thing as indigenous knowledge. But is knowledge really one and universal? That's an important question to ask. This is the claim this is my claim. This is the claim of Western modernity. I think this is a claim that is specific to modernity. And modernity is only Western modernity. There is no Eastern modernity. Modernity, the West claims modernity is theirs. And it is not, and this is, if we accept modernity, we have to accept the Western variety of modernity. It is not a variety, it is one. So the founding philosopher of Western modernity was Immanuel Kant. Kant argued with wonderful intricacy that knowledge as pursuit of truth can be of only one kind, and the principles on which knowledge is founded are the ones that are implicit in modern scientific inquiry. For instance, the first and one of the greatest thinkers of scientific modernity, or practitioners of scientific modernity, is Newton. Rationality is the instrument or mechanism which enables us to pursue knowledge. Rational procedure must therefore also be universally valid. The claim of universality for knowledge and rationality implies that they are independent of the contingencies of geographical boundaries. What is knowledge in one place is knowledge everywhere, whatever other human differences there may be from place to place. These fundamentals of modernity have been very seriously questioned by postmodernity, about which we have all heard. There are, in the postmodern perspective, different kinds of knowledge and correspondingly different kinds of rationality, different kinds of logic, and even different kinds of truth. The different kinds of knowledge sustain different kinds of discourses. The scientific discourse, the gender discourse, the feminist discourse, the colonial discourse, the nationalist discourse, the Brahmanical discourse, the Dalit discourse, and so on. It would seem that in the postmodern perspective, the arena of knowledge is split into self-enclosed areas of discourse, each with its own criteria of truth and falsehood, validity and invalidity. But there is, however, a pervasive clinging idea running across the diversity of discourses that what is crucial in the entire knowledge enterprise is the genesis of knowledge. What psychological and socio-historical contingencies give rise to knowledge rather than what knowledge is in itself. So they are more interested, this postmodern thinkers who talk about great variety of knowledge and great variety of discourses embodying knowledge. Their claim is that it is not so much about what is there, it is really so much about how knowledge is produced. And the driving force of the genesis of knowledge, how knowledge is produced, is power. Something like the core of this idea is to be found in some of the pregnant aphoristic sayings of Nietzsche, the great, somewhat unsung German philosopher of the 19th century. However, the power idea can be carried too far. And carried to the extreme, there is a very short and effective way to dismiss it. And this is as follows. If all knowledge is a function of power, it is power that produces knowledge, or it is a function of power, then what about knowledge that knowledge is a function? What about the knowledge that knowledge is a function of power? What about the knowledge that knowledge is produced by power? Is it also determined by power? If so, we shall have to ask the same question over again ad infinitum. And therefore, we shall never know what knowledge is. We have to go on asking the question about the answer that we give to what is knowledge. So if we say knowledge is the function of power, then we know this, we know that knowledge is a function of power, then what about this knowledge? That knowledge is a function of power. That knowledge must also be a function of power. Then we know that knowledge is a function of power. So we have to go on ad infinitum. And therefore we'll never come to an end in answering this question. If we can't come to an end, then we don't really know what knowledge is. We don't come to a conclusion about what knowledge is. Therefore, we don't know what knowledge is. So this is my criticism, my short and perhaps not so sweet criticism of the power theory of knowledge, that knowledge is a function of power. I do think that this is correct, but the postmodern use of the idea of power is extraordinarily complex and subtle, and an argument against it will require a matching degree of complexity and such subtlety which it would not be, proper to go into here, even if I was capable of doing so. Let me be content by just asserting that knowledge is not a unitary concept. There is a plurality of knowledge, and plurality is not a function necessarily of power. Some kinds of plurality is a function of power. For instance, the feminist discourse, it may be a function of power to a great extent. The Dalit discourse, similarly, may be a function of power to a great extent. But the discourse relating to Indian art cannot be a function of power alone. It has to do with what Indian art is, rather than what power produced Indian art. That is also an important question to ask, but it cannot be just that. So let me be content with just asserting that knowledge is not a unitary concept. There is a plurality of knowledge, and plurality is not a function of power, in however subtle a manner. My contrary contention is that it is primarily the outcome of deep agreements about things within communities, within cultures, distinct ways of being human, agreements within communities, and disagreements between communities. This is an explanation of how variety of knowledge comes about. Different communities have lived with mutual respect, but irreconcilable differences and disagreements among them. And this, I contend, is the source of plurality. So what I've just now said is that knowledge comes from deep agreements within communities, and there deep agreement, profound agreements within communities, and the different you see, different communities would have their own profound agreements and disagreements, and therefore different communities have different kinds of knowledge, if knowledge is a function of agreements and disagreements. So let me take a simple example how agreement is crucial to knowledge, not in the sense of community knowledge, but knowledge as such. Take our knowledge that something is X. Something X is red. Supposing there was among us irreconcilable disagreements about X is red. Supposing I say, this thing that I see in front of me is red. And somebody else can say, don't you think it is red? He says, no, it is not red. Somebody else says, no, it is not red. Another person says, so there is disagreement about whether or not it is red. Now, supposing there was among us such irreconcilable disagreement about X is red, and that no agreement, whatever was achievable, there would then be no concept of red. Then there would be no concept of red. If we all disagreed about whether or not this is red, then there would be no concept. We cannot talk about red. There would be no concept of red. There would then be no concept of red and nothing answering to the description red. Consequently, X is red could not possibly be a piece of knowledge. Agreement can be different. Agreement can be of different levels and of different degrees of depth. It can be tacit assumption underlying a practice, e.g., for instance, giving a lecture. Lecturing is a practice. I'm lecturing now at the moment, and it is part of it is an example of a human practice, contemporary modern human practice. This lecturing. Giving a lecture. Here, there is not one assumption, but several assumptions. For instance, for whatever I'm doing, for it to count as a lecture, several conditions must be fulfilled. One, there are institutions like the dialogue institution it is necessary that there must be institutions. There are specific activities which count in these institutions. There are specific activities which count as lectures within such institutions. That there are limits to duration of lectures. I was asked to go on for an hour, so I cannot. It is not possible for me to go on for 5 hours and for it still to count as a lecture. 10 hours for it still to count as a lecture. It cannot count as a lecture if I go on for 10 hours. So there must be temporal limits to what I'm doing for it to count as a lecture. That there are limits to duration of lectures, that lectures must have an audience. I have an audience, although it is only partly visible online to me, not offline. The lectures must have an audience. If there was no audience, this will not count as a lecture. So there is an audience, although it is only partly visible to me. And of course, a person giving the lecture and so on. So there must be a person who's giving the lecture. So all these conditions must be fulfilled if what I'm doing at the moment is to count as a lecture. What counts as knowledge that belongs to a community as a whole is deep, not easily not easily assailable, deep, not easily assailable agreement about what is to count as true or false. There must be deep, profound agreements about within the community if there's anything that the community has which can be claimed as knowledge. There must be deep, profound, unassailable agreements about what is to count as true or false, right or wrong, and good or bad. All these values are intrinsically interlinked. So if the community is to count as possessing knowledge of these various things, then there must be correspondingly deep agreements within the community about what is to count in all these cases as true and as false. I'd like to reinforce this point via consideration of the idea of a practice. I just mentioned that what I'm doing now is an example of what is called in our modern life, what is called the practice. I'd like to reinforce this point by consideration of the idea of a practice, an idea that has been much in use in recent debates in philosophy. One, a culture is an organic unity of different practices. Practices constitute a culture, one might say. There may be other things in a culture, but practices primarily, mainly constitute a culture. A practice is not just any human activity. I raise my arm, it is not a practice. A practice, in order to, for something to count as a practice, it must be more than just a human activity. Secondly, a practice is a form of rule-governed human activity. A practice, that is, it is a human activity. It is a human activity which is rule-governed, which is governed by rule. Various instances of it are governed by rules. For instance, agriculture is a practice. And you know that you can't have agriculture unless there are rules governing the practice of agriculture, the activity of agriculture. How much fertilizer to use, how deep do you have to dig the earth, and so on. These are rules. And you follow these rules in order for you to be engaged in the practice of agriculture. Then chess. Chess is a very beautiful example. If you don't know the rules of chess, you don't know what chess is. The rules constitute the game of chess, practice of chess. Gardening, similarly. Music, similarly, music. Healing, education. These are all practices which are governed by rules. These are rule-governed human activities. Then thirdly, essential to practice, good or excellence, essential to a practice is good that is inherent in the practice, excellence which is internal to the practice, and there is also good which is external to the practice. I'll explain this. Take healing, for example. Excellence specific to it achieved only through serious engagement with the practice. You see, for you to be able to achieve excellence in the practice of healing, then you must be seriously engaged in the practice. You cannot just go somewhere and say, let me heal you, without any engagement, any serious engagement in the practice of healing. So there is an excellence which is internal to the practice of healing. That is, you achieve this excellence by serious pursuit of this practice. You cannot achieve the excellence without serious pursuit. Excellence which is internal to the practice without serious pursuit of the practice. Other goods achieved, there are other benefits, other goods achieved, such as wealth, Fame, not specific or internal, can be achieved by any other means. A footballer can achieve excellence in football only by engaging seriously. He must, of course, have the proper, wherewithal, physical wherewithal, by seriously engaging in the game of football. If he, without engaging in the serious engagement in the game of football, he cannot go out in the field and say, I'm a great football player. And it will be easily, detected by whoever is watching him, so-called playing football. The other goals achieved, there may be other goals. I mean, you can be a great footballer, and at the same time, you can earn a great deal of money. You can become very wealthy by engaging in the game of football, professional football. But achieving wealth is not an internal good of football. It is not an excellence achieved, excellence which is internal to football. You can earn money by playing football. You can also earn money by doing all kinds of other things. You don't have to play football in order to. And even by playing football, you may be excellent in the game of football, but it is not necessary that you earn money by playing football. You are not a professional footballer. So there is a good which is internal to a practice, a good which is external to a practice. We know what is internal good to, say, for instance, football. We know that Pele, for instance, a great footballer, he achieved the highest kind of excellence in football. And we know what is external, and we know that Ronaldo is a very rich man, and he earned his wealth by playing football. But this is not part of his skill in football. It is in the nature of a practice that the pursuit of a good internal to it requires the exercise of virtues. You cannot pursue excellence that is internal to a practice if you don't have certain qualities of character. Qualities of character such as honesty, sense of justice, courage, and so on. Take the game of football. To cheat in football, I mean, if you're not honest, is to defeat the very purpose of the pursuit of excellence in football. If you cannot cheat and achieve excellence in football. Also, one must be capable of giving others their due. If you're selfish in a game of football, then you can never achieve the excellence that is internal to football. You cannot go, far. You cannot go far in achieving the internal excellence. Excellence that is internal to football. You must be unselfish. You must know when to pass the ball to somebody, when not to pass, and so on. When to give it to another person behind rather than a person in front, and so on. Also, one must be capable of giving others their due, that is fairness, justice, recognizing and acknowledging excellence achieved by others and putting one's own achievement in perspective. You have to be able to put your own achievement in perspective. That is, you know that some people are better than you, some people have been better than you, and others may be not so good as you are. So one must be prepared to put one's limbs at risk. One must have courage to be able to play football. What is true of football is true of other practices as well. Then a practice is embedded in its history and tradition. Standards of excellence are set frequently by historical reference, e.g., healing. You have to refer to what has happened in the past. Who are the great achievers of the past? Frequently by historical reference. Healing agriculture, education, music. You must know music, Western music. Western music, you don't know what internal excellence in Western classical music is unless you know Mozart or Beethoven or Wagner. So unless you Bach, so on. Unless you know the music of these people, you don't know what internal excellence in the practice of music is. Similarly with Indian classical music. Music, dance, and other forms of creative activity. Also hunting, weaving, and so on. Then I'd like to think of a culture as an internally or organically connected network of practices. Human life would be recognizably different if it were not organized in terms of practices in the sense we have indicated. I can go on about this, but anyway, so let me get on to the next point. A practice derives its authenticity and validity from its place among the network of practices that constitute the community, from its sense of stable belonging among other practices. A practice is a part of a particular culture, indigenous culture, depending on the depth of its place in that culture. Also, a practice may crucially derive its strength from particular sensibilities and sensory powers that a community might have developed from its distinct and intimate interaction with nature. For instance, tsunami, hunting, and something like the sixth sense of the for herbs. Think of the timely steps taken by some of the tribes of the Andaman Nicobar Islands to escape the fury of the tsunami of 2006. This is indigenous knowledge, which comes from a particular variety of practicing this practice. Not a single person belonging to the tribes comes to any harm, while hundreds among neighboring non-tribal population perished in the ravaging floods. This only comes from knowledge, and this knowledge is embedded in a practice, and this is a practice which is specific to the Andaman Nicobar tribe. It is the community's language that weaves the practices together in a network of significations and meanings. Language is also extraordinarily important. Language, as it were, embodies these practices. Language is the frame of the community's culture and tradition. It holds them together. When an indigenous practice, which includes indigenous knowledge, is taken out of the context of its original home and made to serve much wider needs in a modern context, it may radically change its character. It has to be institutionalized in an unrecognizably different way, extracted or abstracted from the context of its original network of practices. You kind of take it out and place it in our times and make use of it. You can make use of it only by institutionalizing it or placing it within the context of a particular institution, which is art, which is modern. So it may radically change, and in doing this, it may radically change its character. It has to be institutionalized in an unrecognizably different way and turned into a profession with its own set of modern skills. So we have a Ministry of Ayush, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Ayush. With Ayush healing centers across the Ministry of Ayush, which is healing centers, Ayush has to do with traditional healing practices. And we have a Ministry of Ayush, which has administers healing centers across the country. Experts from the community pressed into the service of the profession large-scale skill development, setting up of health centers, and bureaucratic order to sustain the new institution. So you have this Ayush. Ayush has this various centers. Then the center's job is to press the indigenous practices into the service of the modern profession of healing. So there will need large scale in order to be a part of this modern practice of healing. We need to have large scale skill development, setting up of health centers, and bureaucratic order to sustain the new institution. The new institution cannot be sustained in the original setting. The institution has to be set up in the modern context. So therefore, we need skill development, we need professionals, we need bureaucrats to administer the centers. A method of authentication. How do we know that the original healing practice is authentic? So we need a system of authentication because it has to compete with a modern system of healing. So we have to authenticate the traditional indigenous practice. A method of authentication and validation must be devised to satisfy the modern mind. The end product and what comes out at the end after all these transformations, necessary transformation that must take place in order for the indigenous practice to become part of modernity. And the end product, and this is my serious contention, is neither an indigenous practice nor is it an instance of indigenous knowledge. It may indeed make a positive difference to the state's healthcare activities, because it has made, I'm sure, a positive contribution to our healthcare activities. But through this, its economy, and it can also make a difference to the economy via its commercialization of indigenous healing practices, aided by contemporary packaging and advertising techniques. It may quite interestingly also serve a political end by being turned into an instrument of carrying a political message or respect for traditional small practices. But to claim it as revival and restoration of traditional practice and knowledge would be somewhat self-deceptive. The best that can be said of it is that it is an assimilation and therefore transformation of an indigenous practice and knowledge. Perhaps given the powerful economic and political and technological contingencies of modern life, this may be the only viable option to us of dealing with indigenous practices. Moreover, an option which may have a degree of ethical acceptability insofar as it can lead to products with a traditional veneer, but in modern incarnation. Products that can have multiple beneficial use in today's daily life. But the more basic and larger questions need still to be debated. I shall content myself with raising just one of these basic questions. If indigenous knowledge is, as we have indicated, an autonomous variety of knowledge, embedded in deep, specific agreements and agreements constituting a community, how is an authentic access to it from outside the bounds of these agreements, from the perspective of specific agreements? How is an authentic access to it from outside the bounds of these agreements, from the perspective of another community and culture, possible at all? Namely, the question that I'm asking is, if indigenous knowledge is constituted by deep, profound agreements within a cultural tradition, how is it to be accessed by people members of another community, which is also which also has knowledge which is specific to it, constituted by deep, profound agreements within the community itself. How is inter-community knowledge possible? That is the question that I am asking. If the agreements which create knowledge are specific to a community, then how is, and these agreements are different from agreements or disagreements, are obviously different from community to community, how is inter-community knowledge possible, which will transcend these agreements, specific, particular agreements between communities? It may be thought that if knowledge is non-unitary and genuinely plural concept and comes in bounded boxes of agreements, criteria of validity and truth, no authentic access can be possible. I think the proper response to this is the genuinely plural, is that the genuine plural does not come in sealed enclosures. The genuinely plural does not come in sealed enclosures as the box analogy might suggest. To begin with, there is one humankind, in spite of there being profoundly different ways of being human. There are deep similarities, just as there are differences in the contingencies that sustain different cultures. Also, quite surprisingly, there are basic emotions and feelings that human beings share. Human beings are self-conscious creatures endowed with the capacity to will language in which these emotions and feelings are necessarily articulated. The articulations and their ramifications, as embodied in their practices, vary from culture to culture, and it is these that determine the bounds of meaning of a particular culture. But there is nothing in this to suggest that articulations of one culture are inaccessible to another. One must, however, always remind oneself that the project of understanding an alien culture or the culture and its practices of a different time is true temporarily, going back to ancient times, a different culture now or a culture in the past. One must, however, always remind oneself that the project of understanding an alien culture or the culture and its practices of a different time is strewn with difficulties. Not the least among them is the difficulty caused by one's inability, as it were, to parenticize one's background and one's own time. A difficulty, it is said that history is always anachronistic, that there is no history of the past. History is present. It's present history. That is what we make of the past in our time. So that is one theory of history. So it is true that the present makes tremendous impact on our reflection on the past. So that each generation has its own past, as it were, because each generation, its contemporaneity makes an impact on its past. So a comprehensive understanding of and access to indigenous knowledge must coincide with comprehensive merger with the practices of which it is an organic part. This will be something like an anthropologist's effort to fully understand an alien culture, resulting in her going entirely native. To go native is also necessary to shed one's own original perspective altogether. But going native is only a notional option, almost impossible to exercise in this terribly messy world of ours. Almost impossible to exercise in this terribly messy world of our time. The best we can do is to bracket away self-consciously and to the extent possible our own perspective and reconstruct with much sensitivity the time and space we are investigating, putting together the intricate and subtle contingencies of the time and the place to yield the organic, original meanings, even if only partly of the object of our investigation. And this is an immensely difficult and arduous task, a task requiring a capacity for self-transcendence and openness to the other that is only rarely achieved. These are very, very difficult issues. These are difficult issues, and there are other issues which I do not wish to go into now. But I have, I think, said enough for us to see the importance of a reflection on the difference between using indigenous knowledge for our own purpose, which may be a totally acceptable activity from some ethical and epistemic point of view, and gaining authentic insight into indigenous knowledge as it really is. But perhaps we should take heart from the following words from a great ancient Greek poet called Pinner. You might have heard of him, of the 7th century BC. He said, "Take to heart what may we learn from Oedipus. If someone with a sharp axe hacks off the boughs of a great tree and spoils its handsome shape, although its fruit has failed, they chopped it off, and yet it can give an account of itself. If it comes later to winter fire, or it rests on the pillars of some palace, and does a sad task among foreign walls, when there is nothing left in the place it came from." So that the great oak tree, its remains, can serve contemporary purposes. It was chopped off millions of years ago, but it can still be there as a pillar in a modern building, or it can be used in the fireplace if the wood is still there, and so on. So it is indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices may continue with various degrees of possibility, with various degrees of wholeness, and they may go away. They may get buried in the sands of time. But indigenous knowledge is certainly, it must be distinguished from modern varieties of knowledge, scientific knowledge, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Miri, for your wonderful presentation. And now, if anybody has any questions, they may raise their hand. And Kulsum has an observation. Kulsum, would you like to read it out yourself, or do you want me to read it for you?
I can read it out myself. That's no trouble. Sir mentioned at one point that, indigenous knowledge, once it is scientifically proven, it becomes universal knowledge. But so is that must that be the case? Can knowledge, once, if we know it to be scientifically proven, must it lose its indigenous status? And
yes, I think, can I answer?
Sure.
I didn't say that indigenous knowledge can be proved scientifically. It cannot be proved scientifically, because scientific knowledge is its basis is totally different from the basis on which indigenous basis of indigenous knowledge. It cannot be therefore reduced to scientific knowledge, but it can become acceptable for modernity by giving it a scientific kind of veneer. You make it acceptable by things like, external clothing, like you have a dispensary for Ayurvedic, you have doctors, you have maybe you have even indoor, outdoor practices and things of that kind. And you use modern equipment like the stethoscope, X-ray, and so on. But it cannot be, all these are matters of scientific veneer, modern veneer. But indigenous knowledge does not, it is not reducible to scientific knowledge. It remains indigenous. And if you reduce it to scientific knowledge, it is no longer indigenous. It becomes modern scientific knowledge. It is no longer indigenous.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Ali, I had one more question. Can I ask that?
You need to ask him.
Okay. I just had one more question. It was that, we learn about the idea of the universal, not the universal, but I think it's the universal intellectual and the traditional intellectual. So is there any difference between what we know as indigenous knowledge and what might be termed traditional knowledge?
Yeah, indigenous knowledge is traditional knowledge. There may not be exact equivalents, but indigenous knowledge is kind of I don't think, of course, there's a difference between the idea of a tradition and the idea of indigenousness. Tradition is also location specific. As I said, indigenousness is also location specific. And modern scientific knowledge is, they claim, it is not location specific. It is true for everybody. But tradition, science has a tradition. Scientific knowledge has a tradition. And this tradition knowledge is not indigenous. And similarly, history has a tradition. It is not necessarily indigenous. So there can be traditions which are very, very, very ancient traditions which survive, which are passed on from generation to generation by word of mouth or by the writings that have come to our hand and that sort of thing. So traditions may be long traditions or not so long. Scientific traditions are not long. It is just about 300, 400, 500 years old. Nonetheless, it is a tradition. Tradition of history writing is only about 200, 300 years old. Nonetheless, it's a tradition. But it's not an indigenous knowledge tradition. That's how I meant this.
So it's essentially like a knowledge system, but system, we might say.
I don't like the word system, but yeah.
Because the scientific, the other sort of, the idea of knowledge in scientifically proven knowledge or universal knowledge, it always has paradigms and such, which kind of...
Well, there can be paradigms within the indigenous knowledge as well. And there is, for instance, a great healer, who is regarded as someone who has achieved such tremendous, I talked about internal and external excellence, tremendous internal excellence, that generations after him remember him as having somehow, turned the tradition around, as it were. It remains indigenous, but within the indigenous tradition, things are looked at in a different kind of way. So that is a paradigmatic change. So there can be paradigmatic change in indigenous knowledge, as well as, of course, in scientific knowledge.
Okay. Professor Miri, since we were on the topic of healing, I am thinking of an example which appears interesting to me, and I will share it with you if you allow me.
Please.
Yeah, so a month and a half ago, I was in my husband's hometown in Bihar, and it got really windy over there, and it was pretty cold, and the houses are really open, airy, and all of that. So it made me think about how Indians perceive homeopathy and how we look at allopathy, for example. Allopathy is always Angrezi, it is modern, and it is, Western. But homeopathy is equally modern and Western. But we look at it so differently, and, allopathy, as you know, looks down upon homeopathy and they say it doesn't work. But we're Indians and we've always worked with herbs, and we know our herbs and we know what to do with them. But to the modern doctor, it doesn't make any sense that, we'll have some herb and we'll feel better from any ailments that we're suffering from. So my mother-in-law, who of course knows about homeopathy and allopathy but doesn't know how it works, she doesn't know what's the difference between, and why they're different, why both of them are Western but still both of them are different. So she has her own medicines that work in the area that she is from. She will have an equally effective medicine for something which is not even homeopathy and it's not even allopathy. So you said that the knowledge systems we have are really rooted in the place that we are talking about. So somebody might say that homeopathy is indigenous, but in my understanding of how I was seeing things, her information is actually indigenous, and it works. But the modern doctor won't accept the remedies that she has to offer. But I mean, what are your comments about this? If I was able to make sense to you.
No, that's a very extremely interesting question. Very interesting. You see, we have, as it were, the homeopathy has been transformed in India. Homeopathy, as it is practiced in, say, Germany or in England, is a very different cup of tea than the homeopathy that we practice here. And there may be kind of deep similarities between between homeopathic practice and indigenous healing. There may be for the homeopathy uses a lot of herbs in their medicines, but the process of turning the herbs into those little globes or whatever may be very different from the process of turning herbs into Ayurvedic medicines. Ayurvedic medicines, these are different processes. But there are, for one thing, externally speaking, you see, in India, anybody can take to homeopathic practice. You read one or two of the basic texts of homeopathy, then you become a homeopathic, and then you can become a homeopathic practitioner. And then you have a whole kind of array of homeopathic medicines that you have to become conversant with, because homeopathic medicines are in a certain sense. Each particular medicine also is generic in nature. You can use it in one ailment and another ailment, because the homeopathic system is very different. It is based on system of what is it called? Words fail me. Symptoms. Or the systems of symptoms. You look for a system in the symptom that you have. You have other symptoms. You have other things that are going on in your system, and so on. They put together, and then you apply medicine. Now, this is very different from allopathic system of medicine. Allopathy believes in a kind of the human body as a kind of conglomerate of various mechanisms. All these mechanisms put together. And disease is a disease of a particular mechanism that we have. You have an eye disease or a brain disease or a mouth disease or a tonsil or heart and so on. So all these mechanisms, you have specific diseases. But homeopathy is not like that. Homeopathy is Ayurvedic also is kind of, I cannot go on about Ayurvedic practices. It is difficult for me, but I trust more. I trust Ayurveda more than either allopathic or homeopathic. I have a very trusted Ayurvedic doctor. I discuss very often how his system works and how it is different from allopathy and homeopathy and so on. Interestingly, this Ayurvedic establishment that I go to, and I have a very special friend among the doctors there, they also have a homeopathic clinic together with Ayurvedic. So they are kind of fellow travelers in a certain sense, but obviously they're also different. Sometimes the Ayurvedic system is much closer to homeopathic system. To allopathic than Ayurvedic, but nonetheless, they're extremely, even within Ayurveda, the Siddha system is very different from the other systems. Siddha, they say they are not Ayurvedic. They're different. They're Tamil Nadu. And Ayurvedic is, Kerala and other places. So anyway, sorry, I didn't answer your question, but because I'm myself very puzzled about the place of homeopathy in our country.
Yeah, Reshmi is next, Professor. Thank you so much for sharing your comments about mine. Reshmi?
Thank you, Professor Mrinal Miri. This is my first interface with you. I have read you, but so amazing to hear you. And thanks to the foundation to bring in you to, and creating a privilege in our life. So thank you for this lecture. Very, very poignant and important discussion that you brought out, because then, while listening to you, when you spoke about Western modernity, and then you were saying that modernity itself, as the word modern and the practices of modernity, is the West. And then we are the Orientals. And so well, that is a different question altogether. I don't want to ask, but I'm tempted that then the knowledge which is created in the Oriental structures or Oriental societies is part of the history which is modern, if it is so, like the history which is written, then indigenousness is also related to the Oriental societies only. So, like the knowledge that is produced or constructed or manufactured in the Oriental societies, can they be called just indigenous and not, modern system of knowledge? This is one part of my thought process that I would request you to reflect on. The second thing that I was thinking is that whether indigenous knowledge would ever have a written history, or indigenous knowledge is only part of the present all the time. And my third question is that what is knowledge according to you? The first question that came to my mind is whether knowledge is truth. I mean, it's a bigger debate, but I still want some reflections from you. Thank you.
Okay. These are very, very, very difficult questions. First question is about whether, I made this distinction between, I didn't really make the distinction, but I made the claim that modernity, West or East, it doesn't make sense. modernity is West. I say this because that's the truth, because modernity in the intellectual tradition, modernity really commences, if you like, this is not the right word. Modernity kind of arises out of the thinking of people like, for instance, to begin with, in the West, people like Descartes, and really it culminates in Kant. Kant is the real kind of, the driving force of modern thinking, which means modern thinking, modern thinking is constituted by, there are various aspects of modern thinking. One is the aspect of rationality. That is, you have a particular notion of rationality, which has to do with the logos, which has to do with reason or reasoning, which does not admit of anything outside the sphere of the logos. That is, there is the validity and invalidity of reason will be determined by criteria which are internal to the idea of reason itself. That is, so you have different kinds of reasoning. In logic books, you talk about inductive knowledge and inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and so on. So there are two kinds of ways in which the validity, it is internal to reason, in which the validity of reason are determined. One is experience. Reason as applied to experience. And that is empirical verification of knowledge. And there is a way of empirically verifying knowledge claims. And you know what these ways of empirically verifying knowledge claims are. And there are ways of reason itself without referring to the experience at all. For instance, in mathematics don't refer to experience. Although some people claim that geometry is really empirical. But most people would disagree with this, would say that, well, mathematics, all branches of mathematics are not empirical. They have nothing to do with experience. Their validity is internally determined by criteria which emanates from the idea of reason itself. So there are these two different. So these two things are absolutely universal, totally universal. Empirical verification of knowledge and the other kind of verification of knowledge, which may be called the rational, in slightly different sense of rational, not in the generic sense of rational, but in the sense in which
embedded rationality, maybe. Yeah.
In the sense in which mathematics is rational, logic is rational, and so on. So these are the only two varieties of reasoning that are accepted by modernity. They don't accept any other variety of knowledge. Knowledge which can be verified in experience in their sense of verification by experience, by experimentation, or going and looking at the world, whether or not there are examples which falsify it, or these are all methods which are accessible to everybody. So these are the universal modes of reasoning, and they constitute the valid ways of proceeding in any epistemic endeavor. There's no other way. Either, verify in experience, or these internal methods, as in mathematics, verify in accordance with the internal methods of rationality. There is no other way. Now, so these are universal. These have to be accepted. These must be accepted universally. Otherwise, you're counted as eccentric if you're charitable enough, or you're counted as mad, or you're counted as infantile. And like, for instance, tribals. Tribals are regarded as infantile. They're like babies or infants who say whatever comes to their head. And whatever comes to their head may be very different from, an infant is not possible, not capable of empirical reasoning, nor is he capable of mathematical calculation. So if he's not capable of empirical reasoning or mathematical calculation, then he is not capable of knowledge. So the tribal who doesn't understand empirical verification, he may take something as true independently of empirical verification. And this may work with him. And there may be different ways in which he comes to it, and so on. So he doesn't know what empirical verification is. And if you don't know what empirical verification is, if you don't know how to justify your claim to know by means of empirical verification or by means of calculation, mathematical or whatever calculation, then you have no business to claim knowledge. You are like the infant who is incapable of doing either of these things. So, for instance, the great anthropologist, great modern anthropologist, the only modern anthropologist, Fraser, said that all tribal people are infantile people. They're partly mad. They don't understand reasoning at all. And if you don't understand reasoning, so you are insane, more or less. So you see, insane people say totally unconnected things, rationally unconnected things. So tribal people, they may chance upon what is true, but it is not. It is not because they have the ability to use reason. So that is modernity and its connection with rationality. Rationality is one, and it is universal, and rationality is of these two varieties. And so, if you're going to be, if you are part of a tradition which had no inclination of these criteria of verification of truth or falsehood, then you're not part of modernity. You're part of pre-modern kind of, setup, which had its own kind of claims to know and its own claims to what is not knowledge, what is only illusory, and so on. But these claims are I cannot really match the claims of science and the claims of things like mathematics and so on. So your second question was about whether any non-Western tradition can be equated to indigenous tradition. I think in a certain sense, yes. I mean, it is indigenous. But if it is non-modern, if it is non-Western, but yet it has, it makes claims to knowledge, claims to all kinds of other intellectual attainments, then obviously it is indigenous, it is not modern. Then your third thing was, what was it?
Sir, if knowledge is truth.
Is knowledge truth? Yeah, you see, there are people who say that truth has nothing to do with knowledge. I mean, you see, one very notorious example of this is Richard Rorty. I don't know if you've heard about him. He said there's no such thing as truth at all. He's a kind of he's a postmodern kind of pragmatist. And he said there's no such thing as truth. But there are, of course, claims to be truthful. But to be, truth simply means to be true is to be useful. You see, scientific knowledge is true because it's useful. And there's no more to truth than its utility. And if it ceases to be not utility friendly, then it ceases to be, it cannot be called knowledge. So knowledge has to do with utility. It has nothing to do with truth. And so all claims to knowledge, science is truth-driven only in the sense of utility-driven. That science has made itself incredibly useful to men. And in that sense, it has been very successful. But that doesn't mean that it is more truthful or less truthful. Truth doesn't apply there at all. So, and then what is it that, I talked about genetic account of knowledge, which is what drives us towards knowledge? One, of course, is utility, but the other is, of course, also domination, power. If you're powerful and if you want to remain in power, then you produce your own knowledge and use this knowledge to remain in power and enhance your power. So there's no truth. In fact, postmodernists don't believe in truth. They believe in power. Power is truth. And I produced an argument against it. I think that argument, although it is short, I think is still valid.
Sir, and what would be that? What would be your counter argument to this?
My argument, the simple argument, and there must, of course, be very, very complex and complicated argument. My simple argument is, you see, if you say knowledge is produced by power, truth is power. Knowledge is power. If knowledge is power, then this is also something we know. We know that knowledge is power. Then what is it? That also is power. To know that knowledge is power, knowledge that knowledge is power is also power. It cannot be anything else, because if you say knowledge is power, then if that is power, then what about the next reverse step? To know that knowledge is power, that knowledge is power. That also will have to be produced by power. So this way you go on taking infinite number of steps. You cannot obviously take infinite number of steps, so therefore you arrive at a stage where you cannot claim knowledge at all. If you say that knowledge is power, but you cannot prove it, you cannot show it to be the case. Because to show it to be the case, you have to take steps which lead you in the direction of infinite regress. And infinite regress is very infinite regress. You can never complete it. You can never complete this regression. So that's my short answer.
Thank you so much, sir.
I think it is quite a good answer.
Yeah, because you essentially then concluded that, well, then eventually we don't have any concept left because there is no validation. People are not claiming what is that concept. So you kind of neglected. So negation of negation then, and negation of negation that way. Got it, sir. Yeah. You read some more to understand this bit, maybe. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
So I want to ask regarding, continuity and preserving indigenous cultures. So today people are using modern technologies like documenting through videos or, music, their indigenous practices, traditions, songs and all. Do you think that those help to preserve the indigenous culture, or they in some sense distort it and make it like a modern artifact?
Yeah. A very good question. I think you have stated in a slightly different word my own view, which is that indigenous practice, like healing practice, medical practice, if it is indigenous practice, is kind of taken out of the framework of indigenous life and placed in the framework of modernity. And particular indigenous practice is assimilated to a particular modern practice, which you take to be the authentic practice, which is the correct practice, authentic, correct, justifiable practice. And then you take the corresponding indigenous practice into the frame of modern life, into the frame in which the corresponding practice is supposedly valid and justified and deserves to be, and of course something that has to be promoted, something that must make modern progress, as it were. So then the indigenous practice has to be fitted into the institutional frame of the modern practice. Institution, for instance, healing has to be fitted into the practice of modern medicine. It has to be fitted in. Otherwise, it cannot be used. If you want to use indigenous practice, you have to fit it into the modern practice of healing, modern practice of medicine. The only way to fit it in is to make it amenable to the criteria of justifiability, criteria of rationality, criteria of correctness, criteria of good practice, bad practice, acceptable practice, not acceptable practice of modernity. And in doing so, obviously you have kind of you have thrown out the indigenous criteria of the indigenous practice and replace them by the criteria of the modern practice. To replace them by the criteria of modern practice, obviously, is to distort it. Somehow accept it, and the acceptance becomes acceptance in kind of, it is showing some kind of what? Some kind of recognition. This is not really recognition. Some kind of recognition of the thought that people in the past also, indigenous people, also had something like our medical practice, but it has to be so transformed that it becomes unrecognizable as an indigenous practice. I put it strongly, but that is true.
So would you say that, with modernity reaching every nook and corner of the world, that indigenous practices are doomed to perish forever?
Yeah, they are doomed to perish, but they are doomed to perish. Remnants. There will be remnants of it. There will be remnants which are weak. There will be remnants which are quite powerful, like the example of the oak tree that I have taken. The oak tree, the remainder of the oak tree which has been chopped off hundreds of years ago, and the remainder is used as a pillar, is the central pillar of your building. Then you see that's a strong presence of indigenous practice. But there are weak presences which can be discarded whenever you want to. But if you want to sort of have sentimental thoughts about your past, then you can still tolerate these presences. That's all. It is sentimentality to accept something which is not modern. Yeah. About music has of course become digital, and you don't need a composer anymore. You can let the the computer produce the music, and this music can be quite good. But that takes away almost everything from music. I mean, the composing music, performing it, and good performance, bad performance, good composition, bad composition, traditional composition, all these things are taken away.
Can I go next, Anya?
Yes, sorry, I lost my internet for a second. And yeah, please go ahead,
Okay.
Akansha.
Yeah, so first, thank you so much, sir, to have you here. I'm very delighted to hear you. So I just want to know your opinion regarding, as you talked about postmodernism as well. So they more or less talk about how inter-community dialogue possible. Like there are several truths. Each indigenous community has their own truth values in their communities, and how we can come over with this hegemonic approach to make a good, as I'm talking about in terms of mostly ecological conservation and environmental sustainability. So uh, how their approach to come as a more sustainable and inter-community or intercultural dialogue possible to make a more sustainable community to live. So I would be very happy if you give your opinion on this. Thank you.
Well, certainly, well, as I said, I think at some point I said that, well, of course, communities, are bound by ties of their culture. You see, or the example of language. Language, I would like to say that language embodies a culture. And the native speakers of a language are the members of that culture. You see, a native speaker of a language, he starts learning his language from when it is an infant, from his, members of his family, then members of the immediate community neighborhood, and the larger community neighborhood, and finally he becomes a more or less perfect user of the oral variety of that language. It need not necessarily be the written variety of the language, but there are differences between the two. And that is also to acquire this language and to become a capable user of that language is also to become more or less full member of the community. So language and community culture are very, very closely related. And therefore, this culture constitutes a community. And what you're suggesting is that, of course, there are other cultures, other languages, therefore other communities. Now, how does one community communicate with another community? Is it possible? If communities are bound by their language, bound by their culture, how can they transcend their language and culture and enter into meaningful communication with another community? What I suggested is that, well, of course, there are languages are different from one another, therefore cultures are different from one another, but there are common elements, even in language, common elements of language which enable you to, I mean, if you're, if you're born in one community and say start learning that community's language, say till about when you're 5 years old, then you're transported to another community, another culture, another language, you're exposed to all this, then you start not only learning language, you become a perfect user, a capable user of that language. And maybe you have even forgotten your language. So this is a capacity to articulate, capacity to talk about the world is something that we all have in common. And in this capacity to talk about the world, there are things which are in common among all human beings, then we will not, if this capacity does not transcend our very specific humanity, community humanity, then you see, we will not recognize other communities as human communities. There will be alien communities, like animals are alien to us, or people we cannot communicate with. So therefore, there must be substantial commonalities between one community and another, one culture and another, one language and another. And it is these commonalities that enable us eventually to transcend our own communal cultural bounds and access another community with its own communal and cultural bounds. So that is what makes it possible. We are all, as I said somewhere, we are all human beings after all. We can be recognized as human beings as well as, somebody who belongs to a particular linguistic community or culture. So that would be my answer, but this is not a perfect answer. The perfect answer will take a long time for me to produce, and it will be much more complicated than what I said. And there will have to be lots of, conditionalities built into this answer.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
That makes us think that we would love to be in touch with your future works as well, whatever you are working on now and whatever you produce in the future. Anybody else who has a question for Professor Miri? Okay, I think we've come to the end of the session today. Thank you so much, Professor Miri. Thank you for your thought-inspiring presentation, aiding our understanding on knowledge on so many levels, knowledge and perception. Thank you so much. We do not have words that can do justice to the gratitude we feel. And I'm sure everybody benefited from this session as much as I did. A fine class session for our course this year. This was the final session, sir. And thank you also to the participants for your active participation. And we hope you have learned something during this course that you can use in your personal and professional life. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
To the students, we have an announcement so the students can stay.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir.